Well, I see that so many of you are returning, and I've seen a lot of you, of course, last year, and now you've been to all 5 previous lectures of Richard's this year. And it's truly been said now that you all are students of Richard Norton Smith. That's why we had to move you into a classroom today as students of Richard Norton Smith. And one of the great things about Professor Smith giving the talks that he's been giving, in a series like this, is that I don't need to introduce him any further because you know who he is. Go to allpresidents.org if you want to see the full biography, and I will now hand the microphone over to Richard Norton Smith. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all for finding your way over here. Good morning, class. This is a kind of a dual lecture, although I'm going to be up front with you up front and tell you it's mostly about Herbert Hoover, because you probably know more about Harry Truman than you know about Herbert Hoover. But in the end, it's the very unlikely friendship, and it was a true friendship that developed between the two of them that in many ways enlarges each of them. As an old man who had tasted popular acclaim and virulent hatred, supreme authority, and the political wilderness, Herbert Hoover liked to wax philosophical. When visitors to his, what he called, comfortable monastery in New York's Waldorf Towers asked how he managed to survive the ostracism that had lasted a dozen years after he turned the presidency over to his former friend, Franklin Roosevelt, in 1933, Hoover's eyes twinkled. "I outlived the bastards," he explained. He spoke prematurely. Today, 43 years after his death, Hoover remains the Flying Dutchman of American politics. Disdained by the supply-side right as a green eyeshade conservative, stereotyped on the left as a rigid ideologue who spouted orthodoxies while Rome burned. Daddy Warbucks with a Havana cigar clenched between his teeth. His 90 years were crowded with controversy and paradox. In Europe and Asia, he saved more people from starvation than Hitler and Stalin together could murder. Yet he drove to his final campaign appearance in 1932 through crowds of angry New Yorkers shouting, "We want bread." An evangelist of efficiency, he wore a dollar watch on his wrist and mourned the fact that his doctors denied him beluga caviar at 89. He found God in a trout stream before a church pew. He is, in many ways, an extraordinary figure. He is certainly an anomaly among American presidents in that he arrived in office with a very coherent philosophy. Now that sounds like a good idea. It turned out to be a ball and chain in some ways that hobbled him when he confronted events that probably no one could have anticipated. He was, first of all, a Quaker, born in Iowa, orphaned at the age of 8. Emotionally orphaned, I think, even before that. He said as an old man that he was 10 years old before he realized that he could do something for pleasure without offending God. I think that's very revealing. He went on to live with a Quaker uncle in Oregon and then discovered his real home, which was Stanford University. He was in the first class at Stanford, and for more than 50 years would be a trustee, and of course he created the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He went into mining and became, well, eventually known as the great engineer before he was the great humanitarian. Lived in dozens of countries around the world. Turn of the century Australia. At the age of 25, he married Miss Lou Hoover, also from Iowa, the first woman at Stanford to get a geology degree. Quite remarkable in her own right. And they set sail for China. He had been hired by the government of China at the ripe old age of 25 to develop that country's coal mines. Well, no sooner did they arrive than they were caught up in the Boxer Rebellion. They were in the Western colony in Tianjin. Mrs. Hoover, who was, well, all you need to know is she wrote a letter to her friend saying, by not being here, you are missing one of the great sieges of the age. She would get up every morning and sweep the bullets from her front porch. She thought it was a great adventure. At the Hoover Library in West Branch, you can see two more bits of evidence about what a remarkable couple and partnership they were. They had 2 children, and by one estimate, by the time he was 40, he had spent 5 years of his life on ocean liners, sailing from continent to continent. He had offices on 4 continents. Then they lived in London. That's where they were when World War I broke out. Mrs. Hoover designed a cradle exclusively for use on board ocean liner. So, because of course they wanted to bring the children along. Well, anyway, those 5 years, they wanted to do something creative, something constructive. They didn't want to just, play shuffleboard. So their idea of a useful way to pass the time, they decided to translate the 16th century Latin mining scholar Agricola. It took them 3 years. The volume is that big. And for it, they received a gold medal, which he said belonged to Lou. She did all the work. But in any event, this is a remarkable couple. You have to think of them as that. So where does the tragedy of Herbert Hoover begins in the triumph of Herbert Hoover, and that is at the beginning of World War I, when the Germans, of course, invade Belgium, occupy Belgium, neutral, tiny, vulnerable Belgium. And the first thing Hoover does, he's in London. He is the world's foremost mining engineer. It's estimated he's worth about $4 million at that point. He said, basically, let the fortune go to hell. And he devoted the rest of his life to public service. That summer, in 1914, there were a number of Americans who were trapped in London, tourists. And they had no way of getting home. They had no money. So Hoover put together a group of fellow business associates in London, and they guaranteed $1.5 million, much of it in personal checks without collateral, to these tourists who were stranded in Europe at the outbreak of the Great War. Less than $400 went unpaid. Testimony to Hoover's faith in the American character. Remember that. That faith was spectacularly vindicated over the next 4 years. Hoover abandoned his mining career to become chairman of something called the Committee for the Relief of Belgium. This was the first global humanitarian effort ever. For the next 4 years, by hook or by crook, he raised $1 billion and kept 10 million people from starving to death in Belgium and northern France. The administrative overhead was 0.4%. In response to his appeal, Kansas millers gave a shipload of oats. The Rocky Mountain Club of New York City turned over $500,000 previously earmarked for a new clubhouse. Thousands of local drives produced cash, food supplies, and clothing. All of this confirmed Hoover's view of the American people. In his words, if you tell them what is needed, they will give you anything and everything. The winter I ran the national clothing collection drives, I put new tailcoats and tuxedos on every waiter in Europe. Well, his success in Belgium led President Wilson, to ask him to come home and organize something called the American Food Administration. He became, in effect, domestic food czar. The difference between democracy and autocracy, he liked to say, lay in whether people can be organized from the bottom up or the top down. His own formula was simple: centralize ideas and decentralize execution. Efficiency was his hallmark. One day, he had a home on S Street in Washington, by the way, not far from the Franklin Roosevelts and later the Woodrow Wilsons. And he called his son, Herbert C. Hoover, Jr., into his study, and he asked him whether he had any objection to dropping his middle name. And the boy said, no, but why? Why do you ask? And his father said, well, I'm required to sign my name hundreds of times every day, and if I can drop the middle initial, that'll save me 5 minutes for more important work. That's another clue to the mind of the engineer.